So we begin our week on Russia and the post-Soviet states. A fascinating region occupying a very large swath of planet Earth and a very important political player, geopolitically especially, over the last few centuries and currently. Russia and the post-Soviet states make up a very large portion of Eurasia, as the continent can be known as, spanning the two continents, that is. Not highly populated, however it does have a climate that in many places is unforgiving. And the Soviet Union was the largest political unit in the world up until it began to dissolve over 2 decades ago, up until the early 90s. What makes Russia and the post-Soviet states a region? Primarily because of the history from the 19th century onward, wherein the revolution in 1917 resulted in new political and economic experiment with socialism. Central planning and authoritarian control shaped the political, economic, and social conditions. We'll learn a lot more about that as the week continues. And in this presentation, Russia is closely associated with the post-Soviet states economically, but no longer legally controls them. Central control has been relaxed and the region is undergoing realignment. And however, the Russian Federation, which is the country of Russia as we know it today, includes 21 ethnic internal republics. So power is not shared equally with the central government in Moscow. We'll see this within China as well. Various ethnic nationalities within China. But so to back up, these are some of the post-Soviet states that we'll be learning about: Moldova and Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. The word stan here, just we could think of similar to Finland, England, Scotland. It's the equivalent for land or territory. The physical setting: North European plains extend into the west of the region, bridging over from Poland, Germany. European Russia is west of the Ural Mountains. Those are about 1/3 of the distance from westernmost point in Russia. This is the most densely populated area in the economic core of Russia as well. East of the Ural Mountains, though, is the western Siberian plain. North of this area has permanently frozen soil, called permafrost in physical geography, and even tundra to the far north. Here you see a brief snapshot of that tundra ecosystem on the left there. In the Pacific Mountain Zone, all the way on the eastern part of Siberia in Russia, oceans moderate the temperature and there's plentiful wildlife. South of the western Siberian plain, the steppes and deserts stretch from the Caspian Sea to the Chinese border. Very large swath of land, the old Silk Road extending through there. West of these grasslands are the Caucasus Mountains. To the southeast, a series of mountain chains, including the Pamir and the Tian Shan, which extend into China as well, far western China. So the southern area has been historically center for trade and intercultural interaction. Think of even with Persia, China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, all the way out to Turkey, areas that have typically traded with southern Russia. Here you see pictures of the Central Asian steppes. East of the Caucasus, the lands of Central Asia have semi-arid to arid climates, influenced by location in the middle of a very large continent. So you can think of the drying properties of being in a continental interior, such as the Intermountain West of North America. Construction of land transportation systems has long been held back by the climate of the region, the freeze-thaw cycles, very harsh climates in some areas. and the huge distances between populated places and the complex topography, especially in Siberia, whether it be large rivers, deserts, plains, very steep mountains. All this is complex topography that equates to having few roads. Railroads have been built outside of Western Russia. There is one trans-Russian rail line, though. Here you see some of the climatic zones and how that changes down into Central Asia, becoming more of a desert and steppe region in the yellow there. Let's look at some of the environmental issues, and particularly the legacy of environmental abuse. The Soviet ideology held that nature was the servant of industrial and agricultural progress. There's large-scale development pushed for. Russian post-Soviet states now have some of the worst environmental problems in the world. In 2000, there was more than 35 million people in the region living in areas where soil was poisoned, air was dangerous to breathe. Pollution controls are complicated by the lack of funds, by official unwillingness to correct past environmental abuses. Development and urbanization have long taken precedence over environmental concerns, and therefore some of the resulting severe environmental problems, especially in urban areas. During the authoritarian Soviet regime, the citizens' concerns about environment were suppressed. It's important to know that there were citizen movements towards these, but with the heavy central state authoritarian control, these movements were heavily suppressed, and political environment did not allow for protest or the environmental movement as we know of it in North America or Western Europe. Nuclear pollution was and still is a very severe concern. The world's largest nuclear disaster occurred in Ukraine in 1986 when the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. Severely contaminated a vast area in northern Ukraine, southern Belarus, and Russia, spread over Central Europe and Scandinavia even. Remote areas of eastern Kazakhstan used to serve as a testing ground for Soviet nuclear devices, but no one protected the residents from nuclear radiation. Desertification is a very serious issue, especially in the central part of the region. The Aral Sea, you can see here, is disappearing as a result of large-scale irrigation projects. Very similar to Central North America in that regard, as far as large-scale irrigation leading to desertification and drying up of water resources. North America would be more underground or reservoir aquifers. In the case of Central Asia here, it's more of surface water in the Aral Sea. You can see the desertification happening and the shrinking of the Aral Sea since 2005. Kazakhstan has made efforts to improve the situation. The northern Aral Sea is slowly decreasing though in size and depth. Southern sections of the sea continue to decline dramatically. Climate change is deeply implicated in this. The food production system, water resources are threatened by climate change, and yet the region remains the third largest global producer of greenhouse gases behind the US and China. Portions of the region have medium level vulnerability to negative effects of climate change. Think of the desertification as we just saw in the previous slide. The dependence in Central Asia on irrigated agriculture leaves the region vulnerable, especially because of the glaciers feeding the rivers have shrunk, as well as rain and snowfall have decreased. To look a bit at some of the more specifically human geography issues of the region, you can look how World War II and the Cold War left a very lasting effect, divided politically and economically Europe from Russia. It's known as the Iron Curtain. The Cold War, as it's known, began nearly a 50-long geopolitical rivalry between the Soviet Union and the US and its allies. Even though during World War II the Soviet Union and the US were allied, this split came after World War II. Economic and political problems eventually led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The flaws with central planning leading to inefficiencies and chronic mismanagement. Soviet efforts to promote communism in less developed countries were expensive, especially the large amount of money it was funneling into Cuba. As an example. And there was also, as the problems multiplied, so did the resistance to Soviet control, especially in the Central Europe in the late 1980s. That's when those countries began to split from the Soviet Union. So here you see a map of World War II and the Cold War, as far as the map in particular showing Cold War alliances, the US and its allies versus the Soviet Union and its allies. Africa, interestingly, being implicated in this as well. Peru down in South America receiving Soviet military assistance, Nicaragua as well. And China, though, being a non-allied country, we can see in this map, so, as well as Mexico, Ireland, Sweden, Finland. So those are interesting exceptions. It's always neat when we see maps to look at where there are countervailing trends to what's being displayed. Here we see reforms in the near the end of the era of the post-Soviet Gorbachev era, in particular of the 1990s, the policy of restructuring, perestroika. Government decision making was decentralized and private entrepreneurs were allowed to legally sell goods and services again. The glasnost, the openness, encouraged greater transparency, publicity of workings of all levels of the Soviet government. Very important reforms that issued a broad change across the region in the 1990s. In terms of globalization and development, perhaps the most poignant example of this is oil and gas development, natural gas and crude oil, very lucrative exports from the region, fueling much of Western Europe, even with pipelines running west from Russia. You can see those in the map here, as well as to other countries in the continent as well, eastward to the Western Pacific coast line. Central Asia has yet to find stability because of the tug-of-war between Russia and multinational energy corporations over the right to develop, transport, and sell off Central Asian oil and gas resources. So it's a big source of political strife. Oil and gas development, just to touch on a few key points here. The European Union is concerned about the reliance on Russian energy, turning to alternative energy sources more and more, such as wind, solar even. The EU and the US want to ensure Russia's oil wealth does not finance the return to hostile relations. So there's a certain balance that's met there. Russia was invited to join the World Trade Organization, the Group of 8. These are the 8 most affluent countries with large economies. This segues well into power and politics. We can look at the democratization of the region has not proceeded that quickly as the introduction of market economy. Several countries have held elections, but many forms of authoritarian control remain, in particular in Russia, with Vladimir Putin, a former high official in the KGB, which is the more elusive, controlling wing of the government, was elected to the president in 2000 and has been the country's de facto leader, either as president or prime minister ever since. So a strong example of authoritarian control in that. In Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and Caucasian republics, including Chechnya, authoritarian leaders are still common. So here's an interesting map of the Russian population as a percentage of the total population in post-Soviet states, there in the pie graphs. And in the green scale, we see political subdivisions as far as semi-autonomous regions within Russia. Very interesting to see some of the dispersal of those along the Caspian Sea and Black Sea in the lower left there. And then the very, very high percentages of persons of other origins in Azerbaijan, Armenia, Northern Ossetia. The media and political reform is very pertinent in this day and age to look at. Privately owned newspapers and TV stations criticize the policies of various leaders in other states, often with detrimental effects to those privately owned stations. Under Vladimir Putin, the most outspoken newspapers and TV stations were shut down, and critical analysis of government is now rare throughout Russia. Journalists openly critical of government policies have been punished either through censorship, exile, or violence. Unfortunately, 200 journalists have been killed under violent or unclear circumstances. To look at on the population front, you can see how the high death rate, low birth rates. The region is undergoing a unique late stage variant of the demographic transition. Certain diseases such as AIDS are rampant in Russia currently. Russia's attempt to reverse the population loss by paying couples to raise more children and attracting Russians and their dependents back who live abroad. It's a very interesting government policy. Much of the reason for population decline is the declining life expectancy. Major causes are the loss of healthcare and physical and mental distress caused by lost jobs and social disruption. This takes a definite toll on public health. Emigration is contributing to shrinking populations in Central Asia as well, China being a large draw for Central Asian nations to go work in China. The population distribution, some key points here to keep in mind. Moscow is a primate city, as are all other capital cities in the nations, cities of nations in the region. Along the Central Asian rivers during the Soviet period, development of irrigated cotton farming and mineral extraction resulted in patches of rural high density, fueled partly by ethnic Russian immigration. So you can see that here in this map, some key population centers along rivers, but also just the high population densities in key cities of these Central Asian republics and post-Soviet states such as Moldova and Ukraine. On the social cultural issues front, unfortunately, the very sad topic of the trade in women. In recent years, there's been a large increase in sex work, and the marketing of women became one of the less savory entrepreneurial activities, in part fueled by the boom of oil and gas wealth and industry in general. The business of supplying sex workers is dominated by Russian mafia. We can call this trafficking, is the broad term that this falls underneath. However, on the opposite end of the spectrum, women in politics. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, political empowerment of women has advanced least where democracy has developed most, perhaps because of the cultural biases against women in positions of power. Where governments are more authoritarian, for instance, Belarus and Kyrgyzstan, women hold more legislative positions. It's an interesting countervailing trend to what we would typically think of democracy leading to the empowerment of women in politics. And there's also been religious revival in the post-Soviet era. Religion is now a major component of the cultural revival across the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union that is, maybe because of the turn to traditional practices during uncertain times as a way to assert ethnic identity, especially in post-Soviet states. In Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, Georgia, most people have ancestral connection to Orthodox Christianity. Those with Jewish heritage form the minority, mostly in the western parts of Russia and Caucasia. Central Asia, Islam which was long repressed by the Soviets, is openly practiced, increasingly important, especially in Azerbaijan and some of the Russian Federation's internal ethnic republics. So please post questions below and let's keep this discussion going. Thanks so much.